And I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. Actually, it's been a wonderful day. And before I begin, I see Sue Toten back there. And I would just, of all the people who is involved in putting this day on, Sue Toten deserves a huge round of applause for making it all work. This symposium on the economic crisis and the common good marks the 5th anniversary of Villanova University's partnership with Catholic Relief Services. Just 5 years ago, we signed the Memorandum of Agreement. And CRS, for those of you who do not know very much about Catholic Relief Services, is the official overseas humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. It alleviates human suffering and provides assistance to people in need in more than 100 countries without regard to race, religion, or nationality. Some of you might be aware that during the earthquake in Haiti, we had a relief effort of our own here that we attempted to raise funds to support the CRS efforts on the ground in Haiti. They've been there for 55 years. The purpose of the partnership with Catholic Relief Services is to contribute to the mission of our respective institutions. There are 5 institutions, actually I guess 6 now, and with that other institution in the Midwest, but remain unnamed. Notre Dame, of course, is the elephant in the room always, right? By this contribution to the mission of these respective institutions by fostering collaborative research, teaching, advocacy, and service. And this symposium is an example of such collaboration with CRS and our own faculty here who have provided a rich afternoon of basically seminars for everyone. The classes that attended was extremely well attended. And the purpose again of this symposium, all of us are aware of the huge and catastrophic economic crisis that not just the United States was involved in the past 2 years, but countries all over the world. The focus of this symposium is to try to help us understand how that happened, but also, most importantly, coming out of our Catholic tradition, the importance of seeing the world in the context of the common good. The common good is a term that, in some cases, you hear commentators refer to it as a leftover slogan of the leftist left from the 60s and so on. And I won't tell you who those commentators are. But at any rate, the common good has a very important and significant tradition within Catholic social teaching, dating back from the beginning with Rerum Novarum, and certainly the concept of the common good goes back as far as a Greek philosophical tradition. In the document, The Church in the Modern World, out of the Second Vatican Council, Catholic social teaching reiterated the meaning of the common good yet again. Paragraph 26. The common good is the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. Today, it takes on an increasingly universal complexion, and consequently involves rights and duties with respect to the whole human race. We know since 1990, the concept of the common good has been enlarged in Catholic social teaching to include all of the environment, the commons. This concept of the common good, that we work for the betterment of all peoples and of the planet, has been instrumental in a motivating, inspiring force for centuries, since the beginning of Catholic social teaching, at least in our tradition, and certainly is shared by many other faith traditions throughout the world. What I think it is also important to remember, it is not only a goal that we strive to create a world where all people have ready access to their own fulfillment, but it is also, I think, an evaluative tool for us to think about. It's a tool that we can use to examine whether or not where we are now in time, in fact, is about the common good. So we can use that vision of what we should be, where we ought to be, as a tool to evaluate our practices, our policies, our daily lives with each other, to see where we need to move in order to achieve that goal of the common good. And certainly, we're not there yet, but it's very helpful and hopeful to have opportunities like this where we can strategize with each other just exactly how we might get there, piece by piece, policy by policy. This is very, very important. Our guest tonight, also, William Greider, is someone who has said that he often believes that this crisis today presents an opportunity to rethink our fundamental values as a nation and to envision and work toward a very different social order if we rise to the challenge. Our Catholic tradition says that as well, has said it for centuries. And it is a very positive outlook on the possibilities that humans can come together to make the world a better place. This is what we say our tradition teaches us, and certainly what has inspired the tradition for centuries. And we ought to reclaim and recuperate that tradition in terms of what we are about as a people and as an institution of higher learning and a Catholic institution. Needless to say, there are so many people to thank for the opportunities that we've had today. I'd like to acknowledge first the sponsors who have been so helpful and supportive. Number one, the partnership certainly with Catholic Relief Services, and we have a number of Catholic Relief Service members, Arlene Flaherty here, Ms. Bird, Maureen McCullough. She's here somewhere. Yes, there she is. Great. And the Villanova office, University Office, certainly of Mission and Ministry, the Villanova University School of Business, the Departments of Economics and Statistics, History, Political Science, Sociology, and Theology and Religious Studies, the Center for Peace and Justice Education, the Honors and Ethics Program. Isn't that wonderful to have all these groups involved in, you might say the energy of the university is behind this symposia. And that says a great deal, I think. Lastly, I would like to thank wholeheartedly the members of the steering committee, Deborah Arvanites, Doric Berg, Business Without Borders, Robert DeFina, Mark Dorley, Rick Eckstein, Arlene Flaherty, Candace Harris, Richard Giuliani, Jean McCarraher, Tom Mogan, Lindsay Myers, Sylvia Naj-Zekmi, Christine Palis, Sacha Patniak, Catherine Wilson, and Peter Zaleski. Again, I would like also to very much thank Sue Toten, who is the untiring, charismatic leader of the troop, so to speak. So, thank you, Sue. At this point, I would ask Dr. Wen Mao, Chair of the Department of Economics and Statistics. Now you've added statistics to it? Okay, great. To introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Actually, it's been a very successful day. The student turnout has been just wonderful. Actually, Dr. Toyota and I were just commenting on how impressed we were with the turnout, especially the student turnout, given that this is the first day after a Easter break. So very impressive. Maybe our speaker has a lot to do with that. Big draw. All right, I have to apologize for this very long introduction because our distinguished speaker has a very long, interesting, and impressive career. So bear with me. All right, it's a pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Mr. William Greider. William Greider's 40-year career as a reporter and best-selling author brought him in close proximity to very powerful people. from the White House to Wall Street, from major multinational corporations to the Federal Reserve and its awesome governing powers. Yet Greider's distinctive quality is his critical perspective. He examines power, who has it, who doesn't, on behalf of the ordinary Americans who are distant from the inner circles of America's governing elites. He is the national affairs correspondent for The Nation, the country's oldest and the largest political weekly. His career has spanned newspapers, small and large, magazines, public television, and books. He writes about capitalism and about democracy and explains how these two value systems are in collision. After the Army, Greider started his career at a very small daily newspaper, the Wheaton Daily Journal in Wheaton, Illinois, where he covered everything from school board meetings to murders. From there, he moved up to the Louisville Times in Louisville, Kentucky, and then became Washington correspondent for the Times and Courier-Journal. He and his wife Linda Greider, also a writer, have lived in the nation's capital since 1966. Greider joined the national staff of the Washington Post in 1968 and was a correspondent for a dozen years, eventually becoming the assistant managing editor directing national coverage. He also edited Outlook, the Post Sunday opinion section, and wrote a weekly column called Against the Grain. In 1981, he wrote a controversial account of the Reagan administration titled The Education of David Stockman, based on a series of private interviews with the Reagan's budget director. Published in Atlantic Monthly, the article revealed the fallacies and contradictions of Reaganomics in intimate detail and caused a sensation among Washington politicians and policymakers. An expanded version became Greider's first book, The Education of David Stockman and Other Americans. Next, Greider made a surprising career move. You should love this, the students, young people, this part. He left the prestigious Washington Post and elite circles in Washington to join Rolling Stone, not the band, the magazine of popular culture. For the next 17 years, Greider wrote a regular political column for Rolling Stone while he produced a string of best-selling books. Jumping from Washington Insider to writing for a much larger national audience of young readers was a critical step. Greider said, in developing his own critical perspective, I learned how to explain the complexity of politics and government with clarity and without the condescension that's typical of the mainstream media, he explained. Newspapers talk down to average readers without knowing it. They do not respect intelligence of ordinary citizens or explain the deeper context of power politics in ways people could understand. I made a personal commitment to do that for them in Rolling Stone and my books. Now, he's written many, many books, so I'm going to skip just to the titles. We have Secrets of Temple, How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country, Who Will Tell the People, The Betrayal of American Democracy, One Word, Ready or Not, The Manic Logic of Global Capitalism, Fortress America, The American Military and the Consequences of Peace, The Soul Capitalism, Opening Paths to the Moral Economy, and of course his latest book, Come Home America, The Rise and Fall of Our Country. And I believe that's going to be available later at the back, and he can, I think, personally autograph that. All right? So without further ado, I present to you Mr. William Greider.
Thanks very much. This is a wonderful audience, and I appreciate your turning out. When the financial crisis broke, I was among many people who immediately saw it very similar to the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it. And so we began imagining, particularly after the election of 2008, that Barack Obama might be the new FDR in our lives, and invested a lot of hope in that possibility. 2 years later, I think I see it very differently, actually, and it's not about Obama himself, but I think the period we are in, which is really pivotal in the life of our country, is more like the years around 1900, 1910, and most of you were not alive for that. But if you read a little history, you will see it was a profoundly turbulent and decisive era, say from 1890 to 1920. All of the big questions were on the table. Industrial capitalism in America was ascendant and dominating. We had nationalizing corporations, the money trust of Wall Street, which resembles a little bit the concentrated financial wealth that we have today, and popular movements, the populist, agrarian revolt, labor movement, socialist party, civic reformers of various kinds, trying to first stop the brutalities of this new system, but also impose some democratic values on how it functioned. And you can say, I think reasonably, they won some battles, but they also lost some big battles. But that period settled a lot of big questions. One of the, I just suggest to you as students of history, you would gain real insight about what we're facing now if you dip back into that history and read a little more closely into not just what happened, but what people who do believe in the search for the common good were saying at that time. I think you'll be struck by the resemblances. One of my favorites is an exchange with Samuel Gompers, who was the first president of the AFL. In 1890s, somebody asked him, well, what does labor want? And the answer he provided was more. And that was immediately turned into a joke nationwide. He was ridiculed. Oh, well, this greedy labor unions, they just want more. What he really said in response to the question was this: labor wants more. Labor wants more schoolhouses and less jails, more books and less arsenals, more learning and less vice, more constant work and less crime, more leisure and less greed, more justice and less revenge. In fact, more of the opportunities to cultivate our better natures. That could be our billboard today, could it not? The difference between then and now is pretty profound as well. The U.S. economy was ascendant then. New industries were launched, and there were bitter, sometimes violent clashes between popular movements and the government and the powers of private industry. But nevertheless, the country was moving upward in very dramatic fashion. We can't say that now. We are no longer ascendant, and the question of more has taken on a rather bitter turn. I won't try to describe all of the adversities we're facing, but now it is reasonable to say, what do you promise people who have been expecting more pretty much throughout the 20th century and often getting it, more of this and more of that, and at least the driving influence of believing that was possible? What do you tell them when that's no longer in the cards? I think that's the predicament of our time, of our era. And I suggest we are going to be not a few years, but a couple of decades resolving it. And the good news is that it's a break, an historic break, and an opening for some actually very old ideas to be put back on the table for consideration again. I don't say with certainty that the better selves will triumph. They've lost a lot in American history, if you read that history carefully. I do say, and I say this as a reporter who's tramped around this country quite a lot over the last 40 or 50 years, those good values are still in the American people, despite what you may read in the newspapers about the Americans. And I can say this full out without qualification because I've met the American people, usually often in pretty bad circumstances, some controversy or conflict in their communities, some tragic event, whatever, and in the rough and tumble of politics and so forth and so on. We have our full quota of fools and scoundrels, I attest. But on the whole, Americans are pretty good folks. They are not superior to people in the rest of the world, although some of them believe they are. But they're good people, and they're generous, and usually open to reporters knocking on their door, funny, inventive. All those qualities are real. And that gives me the belief that if they can get their act together and reassert themselves, we can come out in a pretty good place. But I don't say it's certain. It's very much up for grabs. There was another voice that I hear in my head a lot over the years from almost the same era, John Maynard Keynes, who was a great British economist in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote a prophecy in 1930 about what would happen when advanced economies like America became very, very wealthy, as he predicted they would. When scarcity is defeated, he predicted, quote, "For the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares. How to occupy his leisure, which science and compound interest have won for him. To live wisely and agreeably and well." That too could be our slogan, because it's the question we are confronting. The worst may happen, we are still going to be fabulously wealthy as a country, compared to most people in the world. And we can continue to fritter that wealth away in different ways and make mistakes and so forth, and we will still be rich as Croesus compared to most people in the world. So the question we have before us is more threatening than simply more. It's basically Keynes's question. Now that we are rich, what happens? Will you go on that road that we now know is destructive and inequitable and basically limited by events, or will you step up to the larger question of how to live agreeably and wisely and well? I don't want to dwell on the adversities because I want to get to my gushy, wishful notions about what America can become. But just to block it out, this is larger and more profound than the financial crisis, this being this moment I'm talking about. It's been building over at least 3 decades or longer, and you know a lot of it just from reading the newspapers, but I will try to summarize what I think of it, the adversities. First, the financial crisis. There are multiple complex explanations for why it happened or who is to blame. But I see it in a more historic framework, which is financial crises are a lot like famines. They are man-made, not acts of nature. And if you took a timeline of the last, say, really 100 years from the day the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 to the present, you would see that in the era of the Fed, financial crises and sweeping bank failures did not exactly go away with the wisdom of the central bank. They continued sporadically and climaxed in the crash in 1929. That was on the Fed's watch. The New Deal comes in and enacts a series of strong financial reform laws, and including federal deposit insurance and then the restructuring of banking and some others. And bank failures just shrink to almost nothing, a handful a year at most. And that goes along from basically the early 30s to 1980. In 1980, your timeline chart will show suddenly financial crisis and bank failures spiking again. The explanation is that that's when deregulation of finance started. These prudent rules and regulations were one by one repealed. Democrats like to blame this on Republicans. The truth is that it was done by both parties. And in fact, Democrats led the way. They took away controls on interest rates. They literally decriminalized usury, the sin of usury. And look at the interest rates we've had ever since. I won't go through the whole list of changes, but obviously it's more complex than my explanation. But there really are two sources of the calamity that are the heart of it. One is deregulation of finance, and the other is the deterioration of the U.S. economy from the so-called free trade doctrine. That again took several decades, but starting in the 1970s, the U.S. shipping off production and jobs to other economies and then importing the goods back into this economy started suffering small at first trade deficits every year. And then the trade deficits persisted and they got bigger, and at the same time banks were feeling wobbly. The U.S. economy was not producing either the growth or the rising incomes that had been expected. In fact, the opposite. Both households and enterprise and government began taking on more and more debt. That was the predicate, I believe, for what turned out in the current, in the last decade, to be a kind of violent swinging back and forth, both in interest rates and in bank failures and until the final calamity. So that's a second element of adversity. A third I would mention is the mass consumption society, for both economic reasons and ecological reasons. We know we have to change that routine of rather wasteful consumption, whether you call that global warming or basically environmental reform. It suggests, and Europe and Japan and some other countries have already started down this road, a deep transformation of the industrial processes. That means redesigning products, redesigning production processes, and simply living more responsibly with nature. This is not news. We've talked about it, at least the more advanced economists have talked about it for 30 or 40 years. But I think we're now at the point where we can't go further without addressing it more seriously. A fourth adversity, frankly, is our military institution, which is now deployed around the world massively. I make an argument in my book, which is deliberately provocative, but I believe it, that our military institution is now the gravest threat to our peace, because it is like a tripwire waiting here and there all over the world, surrounding countries which are not themselves regarded as adversaries or even potential adversaries, and and conducting little borderless wars we don't even read much about in the newspapers. We've now got 2 wars going in Iraq and Afghanistan, but then we're bombing people in Pakistan, we're bombing people in Yemen, we're bombing people in Somalia, and I don't know who else is on that list. This is dangerous. This is very dangerous, particularly in a moment when our economic girth is in decline, or at least less robust than big players around the world. It doesn't deliver resources the way old-fashioned colonialism used to do. It doesn't deliver cheap oil. It drains our wealth. And fifth, I would mention the dysfunctional democracy. Power is deeply misaligned in this country. I'm not utopian about democracy, but I've been writing about this for roughly 20 years or longer, and it hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse over that period. The clearest, starkest evidence is the inequalities. These inequalities would not have occurred, I think, at least so grossly, if we had a functioning democracy. The trade deficits which now threaten us reflect it, because I know this as a reporter, and I'm talking to people on the shop floor and in bars and wherever, all across the country. They saw this happening 20 years ago. I mean, I'm talking about industrial workers. And they said, we know who we're competing with, and this is not going to work. You can't keep moving value-added production offshore without undermining the strength of your economy, and more especially, undermining the wage income in the middle class that's needed to keep the economy afloat. Governing elites ignored that reality as it developed, and still are for the most part. And they brushed aside the sort of common sense of ordinary citizens. So this is getting to be a serious list of division between the folks and the experts. We've got war making, trade, economic, financial distress. I think we can't go farther in remedying any of those without a revitalization of democracy itself. Let me put the choice a little differently. What does it mean to be so wealthy? And we will still be wealthy. Can we become a more mature and responsible wealthy country? Can we? I think we don't have a choice, frankly, because I think these things are bearing down on us, and we will have to make some hard choices on matters that we have evaded for a long time. And the environment is one of the most obvious, but so is the war making and the military deployments. And so is the deteriorating impact of trade, et cetera, et cetera. Here's my optimism again. If Americans at large were able to make these choices, to drawing on their own values, and I'm not choosing between Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives, I'm talking about very broadly shared values in the American people, I think we'd come out all right. I may be better than all right. But ordinary citizens, candidly, do not have great influence in these matters. So the challenge is really, if we would like to reinvent capitalism, and I think something like that is required, we first have to revive democracy. And that literally means restoring the lost power of citizens. And I'll add one harder stroke. People have to do this for themselves. And of course they can get help from different quarters, including the church, and including on some occasions government, but but essentially it has to come from the ground up. And I think that's good. It certainly makes it real if people come to a recognition that if they become desperate enough to put themselves on the line for democracy. Here's what we have at present, in my view. I call it a split-level democracy. On the upper deck, there are governing elites and experts of various kinds, powerful economic interests, obviously, and the influential wealth holders who participate by contributing or by leading development of issues and so forth. On the lower deck are all the rest of us. And we're not completely out of it. We occasionally pop off and say things, but we all understand we don't really have our hands on any levers that matters, and we're often put in a kind of childish role of yammering at the government and throwing little tantrums. Because you know, like children, we understand we don't have any power, and that's the only way to get their attention. The top deck organizes political dialogues for us. It has veto power over public priorities, things we want and think the country needs. It finances both political parties. It participates in what I call the grand bazaar of government spending. And that, you know that story, the contracts and tax loopholes and petty favors and grand expensive favors of subsidy, et cetera, above all, and to me this is the worst offense, the governing system prevents ordinary Americans from becoming responsible citizens. Now, it doesn't do that exactly deliberately, but it's done it for many years, and so it must like what it does. People are blocked out of participating by the very language of technocratic governance. It prices average citizens out of the game, in a sense. The so-called opportunity cost of participating it just prices them out. And I'm talking here in concrete terms. If to speak in this government in a way that will be heard, you have to have expertise, and that means hiring economists and chemists and engineers and so lawyers above all, and lobbyists. Most of us aren't going to be able to do that. More deliberately, in many instances, the governing system actually shields its most important decisions from popular accountability. One of the institutions that does this, created 100 years ago in 1913, is the Federal Reserve. It was designed to short-circuit democratic process, partly because of the great unrest in that era. And the governing elites of that time, the progressives of that era, had a deep distrust of popular democracy. A lot of my progressive friends don't want you to hear that, but read the history. They wanted to build a professionalized government that would make decisions independent of politics. And I think if you look closely at the Fed and a lot of other institutions, you will see that goal is illusory. It is not possible to make big decisions about money and credit and so forth that are free of politics. There will always be winners and losers. It's not anybody's fault that that's the case. That's the reality. Instead of debating those questions honestly and in broad daylight, they are assigned to a semi-private organization called the Fed, which makes them, and I don't accuse the decision makers of bad faith. I think they think, like all of us, they have their hobby horses and prejudices and their interests, and they are more loyal to them than to their public obligations. Another more vivid example in my mind is the Central Intelligence Agency. It has the capacity to stampede this nation into war on fallacious grounds. I don't say that it does that deliberately, although it might, but it does it semi-secretly. We read about, quote, intelligence sources in the newspapers but that they based their information on, but the information itself is, quote, classified. That is, not going to be shared with the public. Now I'll make my most outrageous claim. I believe this so strongly that I think democracy could have saved us from the financial crisis. It could have saved us from the war in Iraq. It could have saved us from the deep injury done to American prosperity by the fallacies of free trade. And all I mean by that is that if there was a normal give and take of popular responses that were heard in a normal way to these issues, I find it very hard to believe that the financial crisis, for instance, could have rolled forward to its climax. There would have been controversy, and the Fed and Wall Street would have been embattled rather than worshipped as these all-powerful, all-wise places. And I don't say democracy is perfect, but here's how I define democracy. It's about more than elections. It is a promise that people have the right to participate in decisions that affect their lives, the governing decisions that affect their lives. I don't say that it's infallible, of course not. I don't say that the people are always right, or that they should always expect to get their way. I just say a healthy society that calls itself a democracy ought to be able to deliver that, and that it can. And that's the good news, that it's possible. This country hasn't achieved it yet in any full sense, but we're still young, and we still have the possibility of doing so. Our present situation, we can see this in Barack Obama's struggles as president, is distorted by a kind of too close relationship of capitalism and democracy. And I say this without, but the New Deal era actually created, with its activist government, sort of partnership relationships with enterprise that did then and still do have very effective and valuable functions, but also encouraged a kind of blurring of the lines of division between government and enterprise. In fact, government now has to bargain with corporate power. And you can see it doing this in the healthcare debate, or in a lot of the other issues that are before us. Obama tries to serve large public goals, but he doesn't want to overly disturb the business model of important sectors. I'm talking about banking, insurance, the arms industry, energy industry. And he has to, again, I don't want to even second guess him. He didn't create this, he inherited this relationship. What we need, I believe, is a redefinition and separation so that we understand that a strong government is obliged to do certain strong things for the broad public interest, the society. And it has to put these questions of efficiency, profit, output, these are all economic issues, secondary. If the government goal is truly in the broad interest, and that'll be tested by lively politics. The economy serves a society, not the other way around. Now that's an old bromide from 100 years ago. The socialists used to say something like that. But just to say it today, I think you will recognize immediately how it's upside down. I'm a kind of fundamentalist on some matters. I think, and by that I mean, I'm I'm not left or right. I'm actually just what I hope will resonate with most Americans, regardless of which party they're in. I think we have to redefine the meaning of economic growth, and some good economists are working on that. That is to separate functions which are in fact destructive and wasteful or redundant from functions that the government should support. The subsidies are wild, they're not just out of control and surrounded by light corruption. But they're all, not all, but mostly rest on very skewed claims that if you give us the money, says company X, we will improve our efficiency, increase our profits, and this will be good for everybody. Well, it's patently not true that the subsidies handed out by the federal government, take agriculture as one rather clear example, are good for everyone. In fact, in many ways, they're quite destructive, not to mention wasteful. I think we should try to search for a rather stern test and make it doctrine. Public subsidy, from the federal government especially, has to demonstrate long-term public benefit that everybody would nod at and say, yeah, that's true. And if it can't meet that test, then don't hand out the money. I think high-speed rail system, which all the other advanced economies have, is a pretty clear example. Most everybody would say, yeah, that country needs that. It'd be good for the public, period. And if it makes some private enterprises wealthier than they are, that's okay, because it's a public good. You're recreating a public good. I think a lot of the other stuff we're doing is not just dubious, but as we saw in the financial crisis, often fraudulent. The profit-making accounting of finance mimics the profit-making accounting of Enron and WorldCom and those other corporations that collapsed. It's a numbers game they're playing there, and really they're either trying to evade federal laws, which limit their risk-taking, or evade taxes. Those are the two principal functions of that. I think we would add, not all, but most corporations are free riders on the federal government now. Partly because of their political abilities to influence outcomes, they quite naturally, I'm not accusing them of nefarious conspiracies, they act in their self-interest as corporations to accomplish the best tax situation they can and build in these loopholes. And, you know, when we go to war as a country, some of us pay for that war more fully than others. These are not small questions. So now we're going to talk about growing up a little bit. How do we imagine the next American dream? And I invite you to playfully entertain that question in the privacy of your homes. You don't want to stand on a street corner and make a fool of yourselves, but talk about it. And I mean this quite sincerely. We need not just one big national conversation. We need thousands, millions of conversations of people asking themselves, is this really what we want? And if the answer is no, what would we like to imagine is possible? Instead of asking what the system will allow us to have, ask what we want and need, and then see where that goes. And I'll tick off some broad goals, and then I'm running out of time here. Nobody's yelled at me yet, so I'll keep going. We're in the first chapter, I believe, of what is going to be a very long process and painful, because there are some painful choices involved. And we will get through that better if we all claim a place at the table. And yes, of course, that's hard to do, but Americans have a way of pushing themselves into conversations when they really want to be in there, and I'm sure you all are up to that. Let me give you first some of my goals, and some of the goals I think make sense, and then a few bigger, more maybe radical ideas. They don't seem radical to me. The first goal is to thicken democracy, and that's the means to build ways, not just in politics and government, but in private institutions, including corporations, in which people have a right to a stronger voice and presence in the decision making. We need to break up concentration power, and not just big banks, but back in 1910. Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan had what was called in that day monopoly capitalism, the railroad trusts and so forth. We're not at quite that point, but we are now dominated in sector after sector by concentrated ownership. And not coincidentally, one of those sectors is the media. And smart people were writing books 10, 15 years ago. I was a minor voice in this, but I was there too, saying concentrating ownership of the media is deadly for democracy, because no matter how virtuous these owners are, inevitably they're going to publish or not publish, broadcast or not broadcast, views that they favor. So you can't function without many, many voices, and that means breaking up those monopolies and letting power be dispersed. We have to secure new rights for citizens so that instead of being cast merely as consumers, subject to the usual manipulations of the mass market, they can be secure as citizens. That means the government has to be both more scrupulous about defining its interventions in the economy. And I don't want to try to limit this, but the idea I keep coming back to is government should only do for the society what private sector either fails to do or refuses to do. And just as a first cut, that's a good test to try out on yourselves in your own conversations. What is it that would meet that test? Obviously, I think some things are pretty clear, but it's a subject for debate. Let me give you some examples of what I would read as qualified government functions. If I am right that the good times are not coming back, at least as we knew them, that is, they're going to be, we can't afford the waste, we've got to deal with our indebtedness, maybe even go through a period, I hope brief, but 3-5 years of austerity to rebuild savings and so forth. We can't function as a decent, equitable society unless government provides a platform of essential needs for people. And I mean, the obvious one is healthcare, which we're not there in a universal sense. The government's taken some steps. We would like to believe it works. I think it's probably still inadequate to the challenge, but we'll see. Savings have been destroyed and collapsed in the last 25 years. Private pension funds are a wreck. 401ks are an illusion. Most people who have them do not begin to accumulate enough to retire on, and most people don't have one. I think the solution is pretty obvious. I think virtually all other advanced economies have them. It's a national pension system, alongside or on top of Social Security. Right now, the governing classes in Washington are talking about whacking Social Security. I don't know if you've read about that, but it's in the pipeline. I think that's obscene given what's happened to people. The crisis, they should be doing the opposite. They should be building a new pension system. And I hope, I predict, this will be on the agenda because it's a necessity, and whatever the politicians are now telling themselves. There's nothing really radical in anything I'm saying here. If you go back to 1944, Franklin Roosevelt delivered a memorable speech which was dubbed the Second Bill of Rights. And he enumerates a very similar kind of list of what people need to live well in a highly complex industrial economy, society. And these and a bunch of others were on his list. Some of them actually were realized, at least partially, after the war. And I think it wouldn't hurt us at all to dust off that list and seriously examine what needs to be addressed now. Education is most obvious now. I think we have it almost upside down. And what I mean by that is, look at what the federal government devotes to Harvard and other Ivy League research universities, and what it devotes to community colleges. It's pretty staggering contrast. And I'm not picking on Harvard or the Ivy League. It's just that the priorities are backwards. Early childhood education, which is now well developed in the science of what it means to very young children, I mean, just beyond infancy, to be given the kind of educational assistance that most of us probably got in our childhoods, that is intense verbal contacts and reading material, et cetera, et cetera. That would probably make a bigger contribution to eliminating inequalities in the economy and the wage system than anything else we could do, because it would give those children a clearer shot at the regular education system. Instead, the rhetorical focus is on the other end, and here I not offend anybody who's in a major university like Villanova, but we do not need more MBAs, believe it or not. Or not to mention PhDs. Oh, I said it, I don't know. No, we need more PhDs, but what am I? I'm being playful, but my point is, the idea that education is going to save us from these economic forces is an illusion. And I won't go through why I believe that, but I just point out to you, and I learned this traveling the world, it's a very important thing to understand, and I got it right in my guts again and again in Asia and Europe and Latin America. People are capable everywhere in the world. That's a very simple statement, but most Americans down deep don't believe it. They think somehow we're higher on the ladder, and because we're more virtuous or smarter or whatever, and if these other folks climb up the ladder after us, we'll just go a few rungs higher. That's basically the educational illusion that Americans are playing. I am not against education. I love education. But my point is that that's only education for this good life we're describing, in my view, means helping children feel at home in the world. Again, it sounds simple, but I really mean in every way. The world is a wondrous place, full of interesting complexities, and children should be free in their development to explore that as widely and as ambitiously as they like. That's all. And every child should get that. That's not what our education system is doing now. Not close. It's about, I think, 40% higher than Germany's. And Germany is going gangbusters in the global economy. France, the other European success stories are a bit lower than Germany's. So my answer is, we can afford anything those countries can afford. we got to rearrange the tax code, and we have to rearrange the priorities. But it's not a money question, except that now it is. It's now debated in those terms. Let me talk about a couple of bigger, and I would say more radical departures from what we have seen. And these are questions, frankly, that didn't get resolved either 100 years ago or 60, 80 years ago during the New Deal era. And I think they're now back before us in very concrete terms. The first is something Roosevelt articulated. There ought to be a remunerative job for everyone who wants to work. That's a nice, simple way of saying full employment. It means essentially a permanent government program of job creation, of employment, presumably doing public jobs, but it could be assigned under terms of contractual terms to private enterprise. They could be delegated to localities and states where their inventiveness would come into play. This is so fundamental to how our economy works and does not work for people that I hope people will take it seriously. Because one of the things we have now, and it's been around for a long, long time, despite some safety nets and various reforms like unemployment insurance, when this economy is taken down to contraction, recession, slowdown, the pain flows downhill. The losses hit the least of us first and most severely. And that's still true. And you can see it big time in this recession. Go to the cities that suffer from that. So public jobs would reverse that damaging, immoral process and share the cost with everyone. It would reverse the wage depression, which has now been suffered for 30 plus years, and start building up a wage floor from the bottom up. It would send real income into neighborhoods, both urban and rural, that don't have the incomes to both have decent lives, but also to redevelop. And all of these are so promising. I think one way or another, they can actually happen. Alongside that is a second reform that I've been riding this hobby horse for some years, and that is worker ownership of enterprise. And I mean by that either cooperative organizations or shared positions held by employees, or there are many variations on the same theme. But the idea really is to ensure by law that every worker in any firm, large or small, has a right to voice and participation and knowledge of that firm. And if you read the literature of corporations, this is actually a virtuous quality that the best corporations set out to achieve, because a corporation has layers and layers of knowledge and ignorance. And the people on the shop floor, as I've learned again and again, know things that the bosses don't know. Some companies recognize that and encourage communication and honest communication. Others suppress it for their own reasons. So we want to break through that. The other issue is, and this is an old idea, older than, I don't know, a couple hundred years old, the belief that workers should own their own work. The first labor unions articulated this, and it's been distorted and twisted around and misunderstood. But really, think about the job you're doing. You know things about that job, which even your supervisor may not know. And you can benefit from being able to share that in an honest, mature discussion, and the firm will benefit from being able to do that. Right now, we have still got, despite the New Deal and despite organized labor, a widespread master-servant relationship at work. If you ask where do Americans learn their passivity and their subservience, they learn it at work, every day. I know this with some confidence because I've talked to people both from the shop floor and really high up in the managerial ranks. And you hear they word it a little differently, but you hear that same complaint. I talked to strategists and strategic managers in some big multinationals. They said, "Why did your company do this?" And they said, "Well, they didn't ask me. I could have told them it wasn't going to work." That sort of complaint. I'm getting a signal now. I want to take you to the mountaintop one more time. I think democracy is the inescapable ingredient in any reform we try to undertake. And we could have another session a week from now and 6 of them and argue over every one of these ideas, and I would expect that and hope for it. But the presence of a genuine democracy matters more than any others. And we can do that in workplaces. We can also do it in finance, in the financial system. And there it's a little different because the investors are often people like ourselves via pension funds and so forth. And we don't have any standing at all to raise any questions at all about the board of directors or where our capital is invested, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop here. I just want to say the wonderful thing about democracy, and I've seen this happen again and again across America, is that when people get a little power, a little influence over their lives, they usually want more. And isn't that a good thing? It feeds on itself. And finally, Wall Street will not do this for us. Neither will Washington. Only the people can create democracy. And that's all I ask you to do. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Would you
That was just wonderful. I don't know how much you learned. I've learned a great deal. Econ majors out there, I think you also need a poli-sci major. That's what you need. All right. We have about 5-10 minutes for questions. So those of you who have questions, there are 2 mics on either side. You can come to the mic and ask your questions.
Did I wear you out?
First aid pack. No questions? Oh, we got one.
Hello. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your wonderful commentary. But I'm curious. I mean, you have a very clear call for a return to democratic practices, but in reality, over the past several decades, there have been a number of judicial decisions, including the recent Citizens United Supreme Court case, that clearly seem to undermine what I believe is democratic practice. It seems to be a series of litigations that remove an individual's voice from this democratic practice, and when the judicial branch of the government continues to enforce these kinds of actions, and how much can we do within the system to really go against that?
Well, I think actually that's an issue which maybe has legs in terms of the democratic revival, because it's so gross in the sort of giving corporate personhood the same rights that human beings have is so ridiculous, really, that people can understand it rather quickly, and that includes left and right. One of the issues embedded in that case, the Citizens United case, is the question of, well, why does a corporation have rights of free speech? What's implied in that? And the implication is that the corporation as a legal entity is actually speaking for its investors, its shareholders, for maybe its employees, maybe its customers. And corporations, I can assure you, attempt to do that in their own self-interested way. Doesn't mean, the question is, did they actually consult any of these people? So you could imagine a law which this Supreme Court might knock down, maybe not, but that goes at the issue of who is actually making this decision to spend this money on politics, and have they consulted their interested parties in the firm, in the company? And of course the answer is no, they haven't. So, except for a handful of top executives. So you've now got an issue which actually speaks to what I was talking about, reforming corporations so that individuals within the corporation has rights. Because, let me put it this way, what's the difference between a labor union that raises money from its members and then contributes that money to politicians, and a corporation that takes money out of the corporate till and contributes it to politicians? The answer is, in most cases, not all, but most cases, the labor union will actually consult its members. Now, we may find that consultation unsatisfactory, but it does go through the motions of saying, do we have your approval to spend X on this in campaign or whatever? It ought to be much more concrete. But so what I'm getting at is, that's a good principle to have argued over. What is the nature of democracy? Who has the rights of a democratic citizen? So I hate to be ridiculously optimistic, but I think finance attempts to regulate corporate campaign money have all been failures, in my view. With the disclosure stuff works only for a very limited purpose, but attempts to limit the corporate power have all been, it just didn't work. So we may need a constitutional amendment. I would love to see a movement real fast spring up that says, corporations are not people. They're not entitled to the 14th Amendment rights of people. And that's very unlikely that you'd get that adopted for all the reasons we know, but it would be a great debate for the country to have, and a great debate to stick to politicians. Are you on board for this or not? That's the sort of thing I hope I see citizens do, that kind of activism.
Who is the John Maynard Keynes of our era, or like such an influential economist that has a great broad view on the economy?
There's no Keynes that I know of. I mean, there may be one, but I don't know.
Is there anyone that stands out to you?
Joe Stiglitz is terrific. Yeah, and he keeps raising the ante on other economists. He and you may know the name Amartya Sen, teaches at Harvard, I think. The two of them have done a paper which I read and was excited by on this issue of what is growth and what is positive growth and what is destructive growth, and how to begin the debate over redefining economic growth, which I didn't dwell on it tonight, but is central to reform because it blocks the cheap reflexes of politics where the companies say this will make them grow faster, give them the money, right? And And Sen is brilliant in a whole range of areas. I said the financial crises are like famines, they're man-made. That comes from Sen. He did the historical research that demonstrated that famines result almost always from political decisions made in countries, not from shortages. I think but I'd say I'd be interested in whether the economists here disagree or agree. I think we're astride a very confused and unsure era in which I hope and believe that some really fundamental things will be redefined in capitalism. And some of those will sound like socialist ideas and some may not, but I don't think, as this crisis logs on year after year, I think the pressure for more fundamental thinking is going to get stronger. And that's my hope.
Thank you.
All right, speaking from the business school, if people truly are self-interested, then how would a true democracy, or getting back to a democracy, actually indeed help society? And then also as a follow-up, I was just wondering what your opinion of the budget deficit is and how you would go about solving that. Because, for example, I think it takes like over $400,000 a year to keep like a farm or manufacturing job in the U.S. And I don't see how that would actually, be in public interest to keep those middle-class jobs still in the U.S.
The first we are all self-interested, and we are all idealistic, and I don't see any contradiction in that. The human animal is a bundle of impossible to measure reflexes, and I think the science, so-called, of economics brutally simplifies human existence to its own convenient equations of what motivates economic man, and I think it's bunk. It always has been bunk. I mean, Milton Friedman, in my view, was a very destructive thinker, and we're still paying for it. And he ratified and blessed a very hard-nosed, self-interested dogma, and never came back to clean up the mess, frankly. I mean, he pretended that it had succeeded, but it was clearly not succeeding in reality. And I think the economics, again, I hope the professors here will straighten me out. I think the economics profession is in crisis right now because there are too many smart, good economists who understand that if anybody failed as a science, it was economics in the last 25 years. And in terms of the U.S., it's still failing. But there are bubbles all around the world of people trying to change that. And I think that process may very well create a grand theory. Keynes's theory was published, I think, in 1936, well into the recession, or the Depression, although he had been saying similar things for some years before that, but his magnum opus was what I'm getting at is people have to absorb what this new reality teaches before they can write that masterpiece. On the other question it's a longer conversation and you all are exhausted by my talk, but the terms of trade are changing right now on the U.S. And the assumption of the free trade theory was that you can move these expensive labor union jobs off to Indonesia or China, Malaysia, Thailand. And the companies that produce the goods will then bring back the cheap components put them in the package and sell them to Americans. And the U.S. will match the imports with exports. Well, first of all, it's failed utterly to match with exports. But secondly, what they're doing is just subtracting from the aggregate demand needed to buy those goods. And if you go to the trade experts, they will say the trade deficit every year subtracts from U.S. growth. So a few years back, before the crash, U.S. trade deficit with the rest of the world was something almost 6% of GDP. Think of that. That's a big bite. And if we get out of this ditch, it will resume growing again because nothing has been changed. So my short answer is we can't afford free trade in those terms any longer. And I just add, the question to research and dig into is why doesn't this happen to Germany, Japan, most of the rest of Europe, China, Singapore, Taiwan? Make your own list. And I think you'll find, if you do an honest search, you'll discover that none of those countries that have been very successful in global trade have anything close to the American model. The American model says, if it's good for U.S. multinationals, it'll be good for the United States. And I say, and I'm not alone, that's wrong. It's just wrong. Other countries have something guiding their multinationals and inhibiting them from just doing what U.S. multinationals do. Doesn't mean they aren't under pressure, but they have national obligations. And that's what I think is the beginning of a solution.
Well, thank you all for coming. I just have a couple of announcements. One is that Mr. Greider's book, the new book, Come Home America, is available, I think, in the back for sale, and he's going to sign it. So feel free to pick up a copy as you leave. And another thing is that the signing sheet for the students are in the foyer, right? For those students to sign. And of course, Mr. Greider will be on Radio Time. Is it tomorrow?
Yeah, I think it's 11, I think, on
11 a.m.?
Marty Moss Cone. WHYY.
Keep it
Tomorrow at 11.
And so we won't keep you too long. Well, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you. Thank you.